Hello, my name is John Reynolds. Welcome to Extraordinary Life Stories. On this episode, I'm talking with Richard Meddings, the chairman of the NHS. Richard is a distinguished leader, bringing decades of expertise from the financial and corporate sectors to one of the UK's most vital institutions. Known for his strategic vision and ability to drive transformation, Richard has held senior roles at some of the world's most leading financial organisations. Appointed to chairman of the NHS in 2022, Richard has been instrumental in addressing the challenges of modern healthcare, focusing on innovation, financial sustainability, and improved patient care. I'm really looking forward to talking with Richard, so let's get into it. Richard, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for asking me.
Tell me, who is Richard Meddings?
Goodness, that's a question, isn't it? So, I am the chair of NHS England, and I come from the financial services industry before I came to the NHS. But before I started work, I was born in Wolverhampton, one of 5 children. Actually, we had a very interesting, difficult, in some ways challenging background, because my father died when I was 11 or just turned 12, actually. And then my mum was quite ill for a couple of years. And there were 5 of us in a 6-year span. Because I'm one of twins, so I've got an older sister. I had a younger sister who's passed away, and I've got 2 brothers, one of whom is a twin. My dad actually was the town clerk in Wolverhampton, and also came from a very interesting background, I think, challenging background. But as I say, he passed away, and the thing that first, I think, helped me was actually my school, which was Wolverhampton Grammar School. I didn't realise till after I'd left, actually. Was really good at pastoral care. And so my twin brother and I had arrived at the school in September, and my dad died in April. And they basically asked 2 prefects to look sort of man-to-man mark us, really, and look after us, without us even knowing they were doing that, and just to make sure that we were brought into as much of the school's activities as possible, as well as the academic stuff, playing in the sports, singing in the choirs. And the school basically put its arms around us, actually, and I think that was really important in my life, actually, one, my father dying, and then 2, going through a very difficult 2-year period when my mum was so ill. But the school was a real sort of supporter. It's an interesting family.
It gives great context as well, because you as the chairman of NHS England, there's a lot of people that would want to know about the person, about the individual. Yeah. And there's a corporate career that led into that. Yeah. But as Richard Meddings himself, I really appreciate you elaborating that and giving people a chance to know who you are.
So the school was brilliant. And so I talked about pastoral care, but because of the education I was fortunate enough to get at Wolverhampton Grammar School, I then was fortunate I got to Oxford, where I studied history. And I remember going to Oxford to this day. My mum drove me there in this yellow Triumph Dolomite. We bought a new trunk which had my name stenciled on it. I'm not sure that's what everybody else did, but I was at a state school. I think I'd been abroad for a week in my life, which was on a choir tour in Belgium. And I arrived in a really rather loud pinstripe suit, my first suit with hair down to my shoulders, and pretty naive about the world, actually, but pretty driven and hardworking and so on. And Exeter College, Oxford, also completely opened my horizons and showed me much more of the world than I'd ever really seen. My gap year I'd spent working for the Department of Health and Social Security, and then after Oxford I did accounting, and so we go into the corporate world.
And ultimately into finance.
Yeah, so I'm not very rebellious as an individual, so I often say that when I was leaving Oxford, I didn't really know what to do, and my mum kept saying, be a lawyer like your father was. And the extent of my rebelliousness was actually to become an accountant. So that's how rebellious I was. So I actually trained as an accountant. And I did that because I didn't know much about the commercial world. My family wasn't in a commercial world at all. And I just thought it was probably the best way to learn it and to get qualified. I do think actually it's important to continue to develop and continue to demonstrate skills, even if you can evidence them with certificates, or just continue to develop their skills. And I think that's really, really important. So for me, it was getting a qualification, which was an important qualification, and getting an insight into a commercial world where I thought I was probably heading.
Leading into, as we sit here now, again, chairman of NHS England, there's so much experience you can bring into that. But it's interesting because you haven't got, I guess, the medical background, but you don't need that. But you're surrounded by, dare I say, advisors and people that can help you with that. But those skill sets, crisis management stands out for me. 2008 financial crisis.
Yeah.
I'm interested to know how you were drawn to the NHS, whether there was a desire and an intrigue to get involved, and whether there was an element of them pulling you and headhunting and wanting you to come in.
I do like challenges. And after I'd been working as an executive in financial services, which I did till about 2014, I then had developed a non-executive plural career with a number of other financial services, predominantly financial services businesses, but also importantly HM Treasury. So I sat on the board of HM Treasury for 7 years and also did a piece of work for the Department of Education for 4 years. And so I was approached by headhunters for the NHS England role, and without it sounding biblical, I said no 3 times. And I said, I've got absolutely no relevant skills. I've got no medical knowledge. And the answer really was a very good one. It was actually the last thing we need in the chair is medical knowledge, because actually we have an abundance of medical knowledge around the system. What we actually need are other skills, sort of more corporate skills, value for money, prioritization, managing a board, mentoring and assisting not just the chief executive, but the executives. So there's skills that you build up over time. And could I apply those into the NHS? So I threw my hat in the ring, and after about 6 interview rounds, to my great surprise, and my wife's surprise, I ended up with the role. I think one of the ingredients, which not many people know, and I hadn't realised for some time that they were looking for in the interviews, was actually experience of mentoring a female CEO, a new female CEO. Serendipity, if you like, that in my past, I'd also worked with and chaired or mentored a female CEO, and then worked with others, which is quite important, actually.
I feel like there's been a lot of press post and a lot talked about how NHS is in crisis and is struggling and on its knees. I really want to hear from you, kind of how it really is and what's really happening and what you're sort of doing to help, if you like.
So I think it's obviously a very small p political world and narrative around the NHS. And when I speak about it, I go in 2 broad directions. One of them is I talk about the way the NHS England board thinks about the task it has. And I can come to that. And the other is I tend to talk about 4 themes. The first actually is it faces exponential growth in demand, surging levels of demand. And there is a quote from Gladiator 1. I saw Gladiator 2 on Sunday actually, but Gladiator 1. And the quote is, whatever comes through those gates. And actually that's what NHS has to deal with. We deal with whatever comes through those gates. And what we're seeing is increasing levels of demand from a population in England that's 15% greater than the turn of the century. It's older. 28% of the population is obese. That triggers 13 cancers, diabetes 2, musculoskeletal, cardiac concerns. Mental health issues are just really surging, particularly amongst our children and younger people. That's really, really difficult. So we face this lift in demand. So that's the first thing. The second is that the NHS meets it with underinvested capacity. And what do I mean by that? Well, if we looked at our hospital beds and scaled to population, in the NHS we have 1/3 the beds that Germany has, half the beds that Italy and Spain have in our secondary care. And when you think about that, allied then with a growing population which is also older, right at the heart of the system, we don't have enough beds. But it's not just the bed capacity, it's also the estate. So many of our hospitals need significant work. There's a backlog maintenance of about £12 billion at the moment, 5 billion of which is critical safety. So we need to get that investment. In diagnostics, we have less than half the average diagnostic capacity for the OECD. So you begin to see this capacity challenge that we have, and it's too glib to say it's austerity. It's not only austerity, but it is underinvestment. But also on the beds, there was a decision made 20, 25 years ago that we were going to be good at prevention. Well, that was a mistake because actually population continued to grow And the range of conditions continue to grow, and our medical scientists find ever new ways the condition can go wrong, so new treatments. So actually the growth in demand continued. And if you took the bed numbers, I think it was 144,000 at the turn of the century. It's now 97,000. So the bed capacity is much, much lower. The other two factors, very quickly, because I realise I'm taking far too long on this, but it's exponential demand into a system which has not sufficient capacity, is actually today the NHS is providing absolute record levels of healthcare. And it's a testament to the sheer effort and commitment and passion of not just the frontline workforce, but the workforce of the NHS, the workforce that enables the frontline. We're providing absolute record levels of healthcare. So I know access in primary care can be difficult in parts of the country, but today, or last year, the NHS provided a primary care appointment. Well, it's the equivalent of 1 in 8 of the population of England has an appointment in primary care every single week. Every single week.
Wow.
And that's massively up on what it was 5 years ago. It's about 20% up on what it was 5 years ago, and even more up on what it was before that. On cancer referrals, last year we did 3 million cancer referrals, checks, and 10 years ago it was about 1.25 million. So it's 140% increase in the number of people we are identifying and scanning for potential cancer. So you see those sorts of statistics, and what you realise is that whilst under huge pressure, the NHS today is providing absolute record levels of healthcare. But the question is, can we keep up? Can we catch up? And can we keep up? And the thing that gives me optimism is innovation, actually. And I hadn't realised. And there's all sorts of amazing innovations that the NHS introduces all the time.
Are we talking technology and AI here?
Well, we can do. So on AI, if you want technology, AI, so we
just to elaborate really on what the innovations are.
So let's go AI. So today that we are experimenting with something called ambient documentation, which is quite interesting, on technology. On AI, we use it for histology, pathology, retinal scans, dermatology, X-ray, pattern identification, screening, so brain scans. So we're increasingly using AI in terms of its very good pattern recognitions. And then tech more broadly, as I say, ambient documentation, which is essentially voice to text, but allows me, your doctor, examining you to talk. And as I talk, it loads it directly into my report about you, and then it produces and sort of edits that down and allows you simply to read, is that the right diagnosis, and so on. And it saves the clinician having to write it out or type it all out and then check it. It just can save 15 to 30% of a clinician's time. So we're doing that. But the innovation I find really exciting and in many ways moving, actually emotionally moving, is that so this last year in the UK, the NHS has developed and produced a cancer vaccine. And we mustn't exaggerate, but actually it was a cancer vaccine for bowel cancer, and I think we do one for breast cancer, where actually the vaccine is produced based on the DNA of the patient and the DNA of the tumour. And we could now probably conceive a world where we fight the scourge of cancer with surgery and chemotherapy and radiotherapy. But actually, we could add vaccination. Now, we won't be able to vaccinate for every cancer, even subsets of a category of cancer. We can't get all of them. But you could conceive a world where actually vaccination against cancer for a number of cancers becomes very real. Wouldn't that be absolutely remarkable?
Everyone's been crying out for years.
Yeah. And then genomics. We're a world leader in genomics, one of the leaders in genomics. It's Genomics England. I sit on that board. It's a great privilege to sit on that board. It does whole genome sequencing for us. It's a custodian of what we're building, a national genomics research library that makes the data available to researchers to find new treatments or the way that the genome can actually, what do we spot in the genomic sequence about why people have particular conditions. But in addition to Genomics England, there's a genomics medicine service, which does over 90% actually of our genomic activity. And so last year we did over 700,000 either whole genome sequencing or panel tests or single gene tests. And we now scan in this country for 200 cancers and 7,000 rare diseases. And we've just completed the 100,000 whole genome sequencing. So 100,000 patients, we've had the whole genome sequenced, available in the NGRL. And we've just launched the newborns. So we're launching we have launched a program where newborn babies, we ask their parents' permission, we do the whole genome sequencing on them, and we're beginning to build that database that allows us to be much more forensic, to allow our brilliant medical scientists to engage and to find, again, different treatments for different conditions based on real science. So you look at all that and you think the innovation is just remarkable. And I do think it's one of the reasons that I remain optimistic about the NHS, very optimistic about the NHS, but we need to go back and make sure we fix the basics. So urgent emergency care, waiting lists, access, we need to get all those performing better.
Waiting lists is probably the biggest thing. In the build up to talking to you today, I mentioned we're going to be having a conversation just to friends, family, colleagues. And the waiting list is probably the biggest thing that if you take the people, if you like, that's the one thing that they're all saying is the challenge, the frustration. I have a question for you that's slightly reverse engineered. You mentioned prevention earlier. Is there anything that people can do differently in how they interact with the NHS that would actually prevent so many people putting so much pressure on the resource? And I don't quite know my question specifically. I'm trying to sort of say, do people need to be contacting the NHS to have an appointment at a certain time when there might be other information available? I hope I've made my question clear.
You
know what I mean? There's a lot of people that just flood the NHS, and actually, is there any sort of preventative ways of these people saying, well, actually, you could get this information, you don't need an appointment, save that for the people that absolutely do?
Well, you can, and so an immediate example with the NHS app and putting nudge behaviour and information into the NHS app. The NHS app is absolutely revolutionary. And it actually was created as one of the sort of silver linings on the cloud of what was COVID, the pandemic, because here comes the app. Most people signed up to it because it's what you needed to show to go into various locations. And in the last 2 or 3 years, we've absolutely turbocharged the investment in it. And now there are 34 million subscribers, a huge number of people. So I'm one of them, manage my repeat prescriptions via the app. So I simply sign up with it. It provides much more information. I think in July of this year, there are about 2 million appointments in hospital, in secondary, which individual citizens were able to see on their app and to manage on their app. Now, you can't book the appointment on your app, and nor should you actually, because the population would overwhelm consultant capacity, but they can manage it. In other words, if there's a problem with that date, they can indicate that they can't get to it. So we can gradually improve appointment and diary management in hospitals,
which will help the waiting list.
Absolutely. Prevention more broadly, I often get in trouble if I say, which I'm going to say now, I would bring on the nanny state. And I'm sorry that people don't like that. But if I look at obesity and I look at ultra-processed foods and fats and sugars that are out there, I look at social media, I think that the Australian government, their recent initiative about regulating social media for either under 16s or under 14s, I forget which of those they're going for. I think these are wholly necessary because the population's ability to withstand big industry and the way big industry is essentially managing what we eat, how we drink, our social media interaction. I do think actually we should have a much more preventive willingness in our legislation amongst our politicians. But I realise that's quite a bit easy to say. It's hard to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's a culture, isn't it? You walk into the supermarket and you get to the checkout and you've got lines of sweets.
You have to go down a queue.
You do, they funnel you through.
And chocolates and
I'm guilty of it. Typically I'm in a shop when I'm hungry.
It's Henry Dimbleby who says, isn't it? Why are we having, his example is Kit Kat cereal. What on earth are we doing feeding Kit Kat cereal to our children?
And in a nice way, if I'm guilty of it, you might be guilty of it, then there's people that are going to be piling into that, and then you're just,
So we've opened our third, so going back to that, whatever comes through those gates, the NHS has opened its 30th centre for severely obese children. We've opened our 15th gambling centre, so a centre to handle gambling addiction. So whatever comes through those gates, the NHS is having to deal with it. And so I do think we can change engagement? Can we tilt the demand curve? But actually, I think in some of these, I do think it's a role for two things, actually. One, if I were brave, I'd have parliamentary legislation driving harder at prevention, frankly, protecting the population's health. We have seatbelts. But also, I do think we can intervene differently. I do think this is a call for a different social contract. So what's the citizen's responsibility to the society in which they live? And part of that is actually, how healthy are you? How do I engage? And we've got to help them, but how do I engage with my health rather than just turn up in any condition? And so I think that would be an important.
Have you got something that you'd particularly like to achieve during your tenure as chairman of NHS England? Is there one thing that stands out that you really want a problem to solve, or something that you want to benefit?
So I think it's about, I use this word all the time in the NHS, and it's about prioritization. And it's really important because actually you sit in the NHS and we are assailed by 10,000 different voices, initiatives, whether it's medtech or particular interventions, all good, or whether it's different constituencies. Health inequality is a really big issue. We've got to think hard about how we engage with that. That thing again, everything coming through the gate. So what do you deal with? And I think the most important thing is and it goes to what I was saying about the board agenda, that the board focuses on 3 or 4 immediate pressures: urgent emergency care, particularly in winter, access, waiting lists, as we talked about, and cancer, actually. And then it has relatively few priorities of the vast array of things it could choose, where I do believe that if we were to focus on those and invest steadily behind them for the next 3, 4, 5, 10 years, we then look back, and I think the NHS then would be significantly, whether transformed, reformed, improved from where it is today.
So that's a consistent, that needs consistency for 10 years to achieve what it needs.
Well, it's consistency, but it's about concentrating your firepower. So actually, with our budget, which is a big budget, if you simply scatter it across 1,000 things, it's like throwing confetti on the path. So you land it, but actually, do you ever break through? So the real challenge in prioritization is it is what you choose, but it's also how you handle saying to people that you don't choose, or issue you don't choose, that you are important. We may continue to run it, seed money, but we're not going to drive it through with real momentum because we won't get enough breakthrough. But it isn't that you're not important. The other word for prioritization is queuing. So what do we do first with sufficient resource concentration that will make enough of a change? And there are some things in the NHS. So the first ever long-term workforce plan in its history, we should stay behind that. We have a long-term infrastructure capital strategy. We should stay invested behind that. The ICBs, I think they're absolutely the right structure. It's about devolution of decisioning closer to the patient, closer to the community. So as the ICBs earn their autonomy, build their skill sets, then actually I think they get more and more empowered. There's a technology architecture. When I came to the role, I was surprised that there was no technology architecture in the NHS. And actually, without an architecture, which sounds a bit grandiose, but without an architecture, it's hard to make those choices about with whom do I partner, where do I invest in primary or secondary, if it's functional, is it in finance, is it in allocations, is it pathways? So you need an architecture which allows you to make choices on design. And then the other aspect that wasn't there is hygiene principles or engineering principles in technology. And so actually what's happened is, over years, the technology industry has sold systems to the NHS, to well-meaning, skilled CIOs in all the hospital trusts and elsewhere, and they bought those systems to the best of their judgment. But our interoperability problems are because actually they've all bought differently. And it's a bit like the prisoner's dilemma, actually. But so the hygiene standards simply say that as we go forward, for any supplier of technology to the health service, there will be minimum standards. And these minimum will be things like in patching or in cyber or in post-license support. So some minimum standards. And if you supply to us, you have to provide that minimum standard. So over time, as contracts come to an end and renew, the NHS technology systems, spinal systems, actually will gradually come to a minimum coherence. and a commonality. And that's really, really important, because one of our problems is actually they're all so different. And just to give you scale, last year the NHS transferred 44,000 platforms onto the cloud. So you think about the scale of it and the multiplicity. So how do we get them to be coherent and interoperable? So that's really important. I would then do, when I talk about it's thematic capacity. And so it goes to the bed issue and it goes to the population shape. So 25% of the population is over 65. It's 50% of admissions to hospital. And it's 74% of bed occupancy. Older people tend to stay longer. We have real difficulties because of social care underfunding, getting people through the system and out into either domiciliary or residential homes. And that's a challenge. But you look at that hospital capacity and how it's being used. So 74% are older, elderly, and 25% are dementia patients, high correlation to age. Of the dementia patients, it's almost half are in with a UTI or a chest infection. You do not need to be in hospital with a UTI or a chest infection. Some of them might need to be in anyway, but you then think about capacity. So if you managed a program of proactive care for older people with a high focus on avoidable admission, so avoid elderly admission. And
this is where I was going with the prevention bit, actually, just an education piece.
But I do it from an industrial lens. So I say, of course, we must provide the best care we can. My challenge is industrial capacity in the heart of the business in the hospitals. And they are overwhelmed by elderly people, many of whom don't need to be in. And as I say, I can't build hospitals or beds fast enough, even there's lots of money, and there isn't. So how do I use that capacity differently? So if we focused on that, we could create more capacity within the current capacity and better treat those older people. But we need to be very driven at it's a key priority to go after that group, which doesn't mean that children and young people aren't important. Of course they are, and I bring back Sure Start, for instance. I just do that immediately. So there are lots of things you can seed, but in terms of major drive, I would go at thematic capacity, focused on frailty, high correlation to elderly. I'd also run different models for primary care because we do face huge pressure on our GP and primary care workforce, a number of whom, significant numbers of whom are retiring over the next 3-4 years. So I think we need to...
Is there enough coming through? Is there enough...
So the question is, in the priority, of course, you've now got to think if that's the reality, because the dynamic of retirement is very different from, I'm a bit miserable, I'll do something else. You know, it has a high dynamism in terms of changing life, what you do, where you work. And so I think we've got to get after that as a matter of some urgency and think about how we remodel, which we are.
There's an education piece back into the people as well, isn't it? I mean, how do you tell someone elderly that feels really ill, excuse me, that there's not a bed for them because you don't need it because you've just got a chest infection? And that must be incredibly prevalent we're now filming in November, December, January, February, March in England is cold. It's full of germs and so on. I'm conscious of time. I could open up all sorts of other conversation with you, but I think if you need it for me, it's really optimistic and positive. You've been a pleasure to talk with, Richard. Thank you for being so open.
Too much, but thank you.
Not at all. I mean, I would talk to you longer, but we've run out of time. But thank you for making yourself available in a busy schedule to talk with me today.
Thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Richard.
Thank you very much.
Nice
to see you. Thank you.